Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. Welcome back to this larger series on different types of narcissism, and specifically right now we're focusing on something that I've sort of termed generational or cultural narcissism. In the first episode, kind of gave some sort of like a sociological or kind of almost a historical backdrop on what I'm getting at here. Now we're going to talk about how it really looks in your family relationships. This whole series is really meant to sort of shed light on what these different narcissistic types are, how they may be operating in your life, and it may help you understand how you're managing very different issues with a narcissistic parent than you are with a narcissistic partner, but how each one plays upon the other in your life and makes your life a heck of a lot more difficult. So before we get started here talking about generational or cultural narcissism, please hit that subscribe button, please hit that bell, and please join this channel and this community of folks who really care about understanding narcissism and also healing from the ravages of it. So let's keep going with this and say, when we think about cultural or generational narcissism, it can be really easy to get stuck into thinking about it only as a parental or grandparental issue. Interestingly, it can actually play a role with your partners, and it gets to be a complicated issue, again, pulling on that idea of cognitive dissonance. You may have a partner whose background was impacted by the cultural patterns I listed above already. War, trauma, migration, you name it. And as such, you may excuse his or her narcissistic behavior as being part and parcel of that backstory. And it may be. Remember that when we think about the origins of narcissism, there are often two very different pathways. One relates to the pattern of over and underindulgence that myself and many other people have spoken about. The crown prince or crown princess type child who gets every need met, the attention they want, the toys they want, can sometimes get quite lovely surroundings, a wide range of experiences, or lots of validation or attention for their accomplishments. Sports, grades, beauty pageants, other performative gifts they have, dancing, whatever. But in the face of whatever overindulgence they're getting, they may be underindulged with regard to their emotional worlds, with very little attention given to these children as human beings with feelings. So they may end up growing up into an emotionally impoverished, sort of superficial performing monkey that gets validation from what he or she does rather than from who they are. And in such a childhood, there is very little opportunity for empathy to be consistently cultivated. Pathway number 2 is trauma. And this can be emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, or neglect. But these are childhoods that are cruel and unkind and also emotionally devoid. And as such, narcissism becomes a protective defense and a survivalism. Either pathway may be your partner's original family legacy pathway. But here's the rub. You need to be very careful about always pulling back on saying, oh, it's their backstory, it's their history, and making excuses for his or her emotionally abusive behavior towards you. He had a difficult childhood because his father was in prison. She had a difficult childhood because she might have been in a refugee camp. He had a difficult childhood because he grew up in poverty. Yes, I agree. These are harsh beginnings, and your empathy and your compassion will be evoked. However, and I'm not moving off this one, however, it is never an excuse for abusing another person. In these situations, it becomes essential that your partner receive therapy to explore these issues. But if your partner refuses, you cannot do it for them. You cannot be your partner's therapist, and you cannot force them to change. It is quite possible that your partner may be experiencing a complex mix of post-traumatic symptoms and narcissistic personality. But without intervention, I can guarantee that these patterns will not change, and you will forever be making excuses for their hurtful behavior on the basis of your partner's difficult backstory. A relationship with a partner who fits more of this generational, cultural, narcissistic pattern can be very difficult to leave because of the strong levels of guilt that are activated by your compassion or your empathy for their backstory. It becomes a very complicated space. You need to have a complex conversation with yourself about how you feel about being someone else's emotional punching bag in perpetuity. If your partner will not seek out clinical care or therapy, then honestly, this is it. This is how this relationship is going to be. However, it is possible that with clinical intervention and couples therapy as an adjunct, there is that possibility that your partner may connect the dots of their complicated history and their current behavior in a way that might address some of these patterns in a way to keep at least the relationship moving forward a little. Now, generational and cultural narcissism are very much kept in place by people who I've often termed gaslighters by tribe, and that is something that comes up in that glossary series video on gaslighting. If you one day decide to stand up against these patterns of invalidation and emotional devaluation that are often observed in relationships with generational or cultural narcissists, others in your family system, other people in your family system, or who may be close to your family, may ask you to cut the generational narcissist or cultural narcissist slack. And then just writing it off as, oh, that's how it was in our country. Nobody talked about feelings, so you're asking her to do the impossible. Or they might say, this is just how parents are. They've always believed in you, and they gave you plenty of money, and they supported you. And it's so bad. Or was it really such a bad thing that they expect you to be excellent at school, and they sacrifice so much for you? So stop taking it all so personally and being so sensitive. Some of you may have heard that. And when multiple family stakeholders keep saying this to you year after year, you're going to feel more silenced and ultimately invalidated. You may become an obedient foot soldier who blindly executes your parents' plan for you unquestioningly and without realizing. Live a life that they programmed for you that doesn't in any way conform to who you are and what you want, but simply what they think is right. The challenge is that even when you recognize that your parent or partner or someone else you are close to or have an affiliation with who may derive from a cultural setting or a societal setting in which you can completely understand their narcissistic origins, it still has an unhealthy impact on you. It is not easy to grow up having your ideas invalidated, your aspirations ridiculed, your feelings denied, and to be minimized through passive-aggressive barbs designed to pull out maximal guilt. For example, if they say, ugh, if you only saw my childhood and how we suffered and how much we have sacrificed kind of thing, game over. There's just nowhere for you to safely go in such a conversation. Now, when it comes to managing these patterns, your best hope is the usual techniques of setting boundaries, setting realistic expectations, engaging in radical acceptance, and to avoid personalizing, as difficult as it may be to be doing these things. It involves skirting a very difficult line of understanding the difficult backstory of the cultural or generational narcissist, that backstory is real, and shaped a personality style in them that is not likely to change. So you can remain compassionate to their difficult backstory, but also maintain those boundaries and expectations to protect yourself from further hurt. Now, it's interesting because these types of cultural narcissistic patterns can also be observed in cultures in which there was a history of colonization, or cultures which have for a long, long time been very racist or classist. As you can imagine, these sociological and cultural processes are always going to foster insecurity and abuse. The people in power, as a rule, will mistreat those who lack the power, and those who are mistreated may suffer the insecurities that come from the powerlessness, the helplessness, and the frustration found in such a situation. The abusers themselves are often more privileged in that society, and there's a greater risk that they be narcissistic. So you can see how these kinds of socio-cultural histories, colonization, slavery, civil wars, genocide, cultures that are impacted by these factors, it is not unusual to then observe patterns alongside that, such as lack of empathy, entitlement, poorly regulated emotions, insecurity. And when a person from this background or culture then attempts to put down stakes in a new culture through migration or something, these patterns from the old culture may persist and be accompanied by other patterns, including victimhood, resentment, sullenness, that may come from the unresolved frustration of this type of cultural history and from the unresolved trauma as well, and perhaps the thwarted expectations of a new setting. Their children may acculturate and assimilate to the new culture more easily than them, and you can easily see then how these fault lines expand, with the children easily taking on the freedoms of this new culture, but the parent who has been negatively impacted by their backstory might still remain frustrated and emotionally ill-equipped to connect with their own family members under these circumstances. You see how complicated this is. Now, another mechanism is of cultural and generational narcissism is privilege. Privilege is the access and the entitlement that comes from possessing characteristics of power in a certain culture. And that can vary depending on the culture. Privilege can be a byproduct of gender, race, social class, family legacy, wealth, religion. People who hold privilege have an inherited ease in life that may not be earned. When there is intergenerational privilege, that can also foster generational or cultural narcissism. Children from these families may be raised with the mentality of, basically, you can do what you want. We're the such and such family, and we're the chosen ones, and we get all doors open for us. And as you can imagine, that ideology is definitely going to create more than a few family narcissists. And the ones that don't become narcissistic, even though they grew up like this, either become really anxious, really put off by their family's entitled behavior, or just maybe really uncomfortable. But privilege can create a strange, impenetrable family dynamic of people walking around feeling like they're sort of specially anointed and remain blissfully unaware of their entitled and arrogant behavior while invalidating everyone around them. Within a family, some people may have more privilege than others. For example, sons may have more privilege than daughters. People who look one way might have more privilege than the others. And these differences can foster family tension. Those who are not the privileged side of the privileged family may have spent a lifetime experiencing slights and even narcissistic abuse from the family. Now, in a narcissistic family system, the most privileged child is obviously typically the golden child. Now, if you are in a relationship with someone who has experienced this intergenerational privilege, you will often notice the entitlement first, and then the arrogance, and then the rest of it all follows pretty soon. And once you meet their family, you might get it. But it doesn't mean you have to excuse it. So again, of all the topics we've talked about thus far, generational/cultural narcissism, as you can see, is a bit more complex. It's not just taking the usual kind of landscape and territory of just the psychology of it. There's a bigger historical and, like I said, almost sociological, societal element here. And it does help you, I'm hoping this is helping you see that, this issue with my family or my partner's family or my in-laws or whomever, now I'm starting to see why it's so complicated. When we bring it down to brass tacks, here's what it comes down to. Nobody really has ever the right to abuse another person, regardless of their backstory. It may help you understand it, but it shouldn't stop you from setting a boundary. In part 3 of this series on generational and cultural narcissism, we're going to take on issues related to, like, what the heck am I supposed to do about this? I kind of feel guilty about my mom's childhood, so where do I go from here? Wait for part 3, because that's where I'm going to tell you. Thanks again for tuning in. I hope this is clarifying this sort of complicated issue. Hit that subscribe button, hit that bell. We look forward to showing you this next episode. Thanks.